Today we're going to do an introduction to Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage. So on the left we have a picture of our author Stephen Crane. Unfortunately he dies early at the age of 29. And on the right you have one of the covers of his novel, The Red Badge of Courage. So with this story, the events in this famous novel take place during the American Civil War and probably at the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was fought in May of 1863. Now, the episodic plot revolves around a young Union soldier's anxiety as he confronts his first battle and explores larger themes of fear and bravery, patriotism and brotherhood. And as you can see from my picture, the Battle of Chancellorsville is in Northern Virginia. So a little bit more about the historical background of the war. During the 1860s, conventional beliefs held that a young man's character was best tested in war. Now, the battlefield demanded patriotism, bravery, and obedience, and a faith in a particular cause. Now, Crane explored the theme of character development as a result of war experiences, but he also treats the theme critically using the methods of realism and naturalism. So a bit about the American Civil War. It formally began on April 12, 1861 in South Carolina, and then President Lincoln is going to issue a call for volunteers to defend the Union and to later on abolish slavery once he passes his Emancipation Proclamation. Now, each day newspapers throughout the North and South were filled with exciting details of battles, and Union and Confederate forces were unprepared for the long war. It's going to be almost 4 years in the making. And at the beginning, the armies were poorly trained, and discipline is going to be weak. Overall, throughout those 4 years, about 1 million men were wounded, and more than 500,000 died, either from battle wounds or disease. Now, looking at the writer Stephen Crane and how he was going to write the story. Now, after the Civil War, the nation's main concern was the expansion of commerce and industry, and new scientific views of the world began to undermine traditional religious views. Now, many American writers found in realism the best way to explain these changing conditions. Now, the previous era of writing, Romanticism, had idealized imagination, but his current movement, Stephen Crane's movement of realism, emphasizes dispassionate observations and facts. Now, the rise of naturalism corresponded with the increasing industrialization of society, and naturalism also contends that human beings are just helpless creatures that are passively influenced by heredity and environment and the cruel forces of nature itself. Now, naturalist writers are focused on sordid, painful, and tragic aspects of the human experience. Stephen Crane's work itself now contains both elements of realism and of naturalism. He didn't want to depict reality just as it was. He could have just been reporting facts of the Battle of Chancellorsville. But what he wanted to do instead was to present a personal vision of the world. Now, The Red Badge of Courage combines observant reporting of the details with the revelation of the forces at work within and around the novel's protagonist, the main character, Henry Fleming. So, taking a look at Stephen Crane, why is he writing about the American Civil War? After all, he was born in 1871 in Newark, New Jersey. The war goes from 1861 to 1865. Not only did he not fight in the war, Stephen Crane was born after the war. So he was an introspective, rebellious young man who thirsted for adventure in spite of his frequent illnesses. And so because of those frequent illnesses, he had a tendency to read a lot, and he had a tendency to start writing a lot. And although he died at the age of 28, Crane left behind novels, stories, and poems that secures his place in the history of American literature. So he is the youngest of 14 children, and he was fascinated by the military record of his family, and he did enter a military school in New York when he was 17. Now, he excelled in military drill and greedily absorbed stories about military battles as described by Civil War veterans who taught at the school. So then Crane also is going to live among the poor in New York City after leaving school, and from this experience he's also going to write his first novel and his first American naturalist novel, which is called Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, in 1893. Though later this is a solid novel critically, because of its controversial topic, it was a financial failure for Crane at the time. So then what he decides to do is he decides to go back to his roots and starts taking the short stories and observations from his past in military school, and he decides to write The Red Badge of Courage. That was originally published serially in the newspaper The Philadelphia Press in December of 1894. However, the novel, once collected, was widely praised both by the general public and by literary critics. Now, Crane had long been fascinated by the psychology of war. He'd read books and listened to many stories of the veterans of the Civil War, and he studied closely the war photographs of Matthew Brady. So many readers are usually amazed to learn Crane did not experience a battle firsthand. And when he did, he was relieved to discover that his novel was all right, according to him. He thought his novel was all right. So the Red Badge of Courage brought Crane only $90, but it does give him fame. So he decides to become a writer and he starts traveling the American West and Mexico. He even helped smuggle arms to Cuban revolutionaries, and he was shipwrecked off the Florida coast, which would prove to be the inspiration for one of his most famous short stories, The Open Boat. Now that one is considered his masterpiece. If you're going to see criticism of Maggie, a girl of the streets, you're going to see some criticism for his novel, The Red Badge of Courage. Everybody at the time, however, loved his short story of The Open Boat. Now, Crane tried to enlist in the United States Navy, but he was rejected because of his poor health. So he decided to cover the war as a correspondent, and unfortunately during the war he died in 1900 of his tuberculosis just 6 months before his 29th birthday. So looking at the novel of The Red Badge of Courage, it's made a startling impression on its first readers, but there's no other books of its kind at the time, and so that's why it became so popular. The novel showed great originality, especially in its treatment of character and its sparse poetic language. And other important characteristics of the novel are the use of realism and of naturalism and the exploration of themes of universal concern. At the time that The Red Badge of Courage came out in the 1890s, if you wanted to read about the American Civil War, you were reading journals, you were reading diaries, you were reading nonfiction. Here we now have a bit more of the naturalism coming in as we have a fictitious look at the American Civil War. His style and his story, well, his writing is spare. It's very compressed and he uses relatively simple vocabulary. Crane gives little attention to the characterization of the individuals, and the novel's important characters are even initially identified as the youth, the loud soldier, and the tall soldier. So what is he concentrating on? Well, Crane concentrates on the thoughts and impressions of our soldier that we follow along with, called Henry Fleming, describing the self-doubt, the guilt, the sense of isolation, and the sense of terror that this young man had as he's going off into battle that he's ill prepared for, and he has nobody to tell him what to do. So where is the realism and naturalism in this particular story? Well, he was a realist in his determination to write honestly about life as he saw it. So as you look through Henry Fleming's eyes, he's going to show you exactly what war would have looked like for a private soldier who is ill prepared to see such death and destruction, and who's ill prepared to find death on his own. Now, Crane saw nature as indifferent to human beings and viewed individuals as a mixture of good and bad qualities. And he used details that illustrate the senselessness and brutality of war, the horror of death, and human weaknesses such as false pride and even selfishness. And Crane certainly did not glorify heroism in battle, something that was usually unseen at the time for the American Civil War. Now, like the naturalist, Crane focused on the sordid details of life and on characters who are shaped by the heredity and of the environment at the moment. So your main character, Henry Fleming, struggles with indifferent natural and social forces over which he has no control. Now, despite Henry's inability to escape his situation, Crane suggests that the outcome of the struggle is courage and self-respect. So in spite of being ill-prepared, your character does have some redeeming qualities. So when we take a look at the themes in The Red Badge of Courage, it deals a lot with the inner conflicts of Henry Fleming, but it's not altogether a character study. So the novel is one writer's effort to address certain significant questions that sooner or later all human beings have to ask themselves. So there's a few questions that are of paramount importance in the novel as you look for themes. How do people act when faced with adversity, danger, and even death? How do we cope with feelings of inferiority, fear or guilt, loneliness or anger? What is our responsibility to other beings around us? Are the forces of nature sympathetic? Are they hostile? Or is nature indifferent to us? And then finally, who or what determines our fate? What control do we have over our own destiny? Thanks so much for stopping by, guys, for this introduction of the Red Badge of Courage. I would love it if you would subscribe to the channel. Even at least if you could let me know in the comments section if you liked this, if you have any other stories that you'd like me to introduce.